What if the interview that changed everything wasn't what it seemed? Sit with that for a second. Because for years, millions of people believed they witnessed a raw, unfiltered moment of truth. A young couple. A powerful platform. Pain laid bare in front of the world. Tears. Gasps. Headlines exploding across every continent. And right at the center of it all, the most trusted interviewer in modern media history, Oprah Winfrey. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But what if that trust was misplaced? What if the most famous royal interview of the century wasn't a spontaneous conversation, but something far more carefully constructed? Back in 2021, when Oprah with Meghan and Harry aired, it didn't just dominate the news cycle, it rewrote it. Viewers didn't just watch, they chose sides. Institutions scrambled. Reputations were shaken. Careers were redefined overnight. And questioning the story, that wasn't just unpopular. It was almost forbidden. If you raised doubts, you were heartless. If you asked for proof, you were cruel. If you hesitated, you were labeled part of the problem. So most people didn't hesitate, they believed. They believed Meghan Markle when she spoke about isolation, betrayal, and despair. They believed Prince Harry when he described feeling trapped, powerless, and silenced. And they believed because Oprah believed. Her reactions mattered. Her shock mattered. Her pauses, her gasps, her what moments mattered. They told the audience how to feel. This wasn't just an interview. It was a cultural moment, one that carried moral weight. But here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask at the time. What if the interviewer wasn't in control? What if the emotion we saw was real, but the narrative wasn't? Over time, something strange happened. The interview didn't age the way powerful truth usually does. Instead of becoming clearer, it became messier. Statements were quietly walked back. Details shifted. Timelines blurred. And critics began to notice patterns that felt rehearsed. Phrases repeated almost word for word. Emotional beats landing with uncanny precision. Stories unfolding in ways that perfectly fit headlines. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe not. Think about it. In truly raw conversations, people interrupt themselves. They ramble. They contradict earlier thoughts. They struggle to find the right words. But this interview flowed. Cleanly. Smoothly. Almost too smoothly. So ask yourself this. Were you watching a conversation or a performance? And if it was a performance, who was directing it? This matters now more than ever, because the consequences of that night didn't end when the credits rolled. Families were divided, public opinion hardened, trust in institutions eroded, and the media learned a dangerous lesson. Emotion beats verification. If new questions are surfacing today, it's not because people suddenly turned cruel. It's because time has a way of loosening the grip of emotion. Distance allows doubt to breathe, and when doubt breathes, it asks questions that once felt impossible. What if the story wasn't just told, but engineered? What if the world was so eager to believe, it never stopped to look behind the curtain? Because once you start pulling at that thread, once you really examine how that interview unfolded, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. Everyone remembers where they were when that interview aired. Not because it was entertaining, because it felt historic. The night Oprah with Meghan and Harry aired, the world slowed down. Social media feeds froze into a single topic. Newsrooms cleared their schedules. Friends texted each other the same message. Are you watching this? It wasn't framed as celebrity gossip. It was framed as truth, as courage, as someone finally breaking free from silence. And that framing mattered. From the very first moments, the atmosphere was carefully calibrated. Soft lighting, neutral tones, a calm garden setting designed to feel intimate, safe, almost therapeutic. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a confessional. And sitting across from the couple was Oprah Winfrey, a woman whose entire brand is built on credibility. That choice alone sent a message. This story is vetted, trusted, and worth your belief. And people believed. They believed Meghan Markle as she spoke with composure about pain that was anything but composed. They believed Prince Harry as he nodded along, filling in just enough detail to reinforce the emotional arc. Each answer seemed to land perfectly. Each pause arrived at exactly the right moment. Each revelation felt designed to travel cleanly from screen to headline. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. When was the last time you had a deeply emotional conversation that flowed that smoothly? real pain is messy. Real trauma stumbles, real memories interrupt themselves. But this felt polished. That doesn't mean the emotion wasn't real. That's important. Emotion can be genuine while storytelling is controlled. And this is where things get interesting. Throughout the interview, Oprah reacted the way the audience needed her to react. Shock here, silence there. A raised eyebrow at just the right moment. Those reactions didn't just respond to the story. They guided it. They told viewers when to gasp, when to feel outraged, when to feel protective. It created a feedback loop. Meghan speaks. Oprah reacts, the audience absorbs both. But here's the contradiction. Few people noticed in the moment. For an interview positioned as spontaneous and raw, the messaging was remarkably consistent. Certain phrases repeated, certain themes returned again and again. The villains were clearly defined, the victims clearly framed. There was little wandering into uncertainty, very few I don't know moments. Everything landed with clarity. Too much clarity. That's not how memory usually works under emotional stress. And then there was the pacing. Sensitive claims delivered early, softer details placed later. Moments designed to trend arriving right on schedule. It felt less like a conversation unfolding and more like a narrative being revealed, step by step. Viewers didn't question it. Why would they? Questioning felt cruel. Questioning felt like disbelief. And disbelief, we were told, equaled harm. So the interview became protected. Protected from skepticism. Protected from follow-ups. Protected from the kind of scrutiny normally applied to claims this explosive. But time has a way of changing perspective. As days turned into months and months into years, some details didn't sit the same way they once did. Statements quietly softened. Clarifications appeared later, away from primetime cameras. And people began to notice something strange. The story hadn't collapsed, but it hadn't solidified either. And when a story demands belief yet resists verification, that's when questions begin to surface. Not angry questions. Was this interview truly unscripted? Or was it something far more strategic, emotionally authentic, yet structurally engineered? Because once you accept that possibility, once you allow yourself to see the interview not just as a moment, but as a production, one unsettling thought creeps in. Control is never obvious when it's working. That's the uncomfortable truth. Because if control looks aggressive, people resist it. But if control feels calm, reasonable, even compassionate, people don't just accept it, they defend it. So here's the next question you have to ask yourself. If that interview wasn't as spontaneous as it appeared, how would control actually show up? Not with cue cards, not with visible scripts, but with boundaries, with alignment, with expectations quietly agreed upon long before the cameras ever rolled. This is where the story takes a sharper turn. High-profile interviews like the one between Oprah Winfrey and the Sussexes don't happen casually. They involve teams, lawyers, advisors, publicists, messaging consultants, entire rooms full of people whose sole job is to anticipate risk and shape perception. Preparation is normal, but preparation becomes something else when it dictates direction. Think about what wasn't asked. There were no aggressive follow-ups when answers stayed vague. No pressing for dates when timelines blurred. No interruptions when emotionally loaded claims were made. Instead, the conversation flowed forward, never sideways, never backward, always forward. That's not accidental. That's narrative discipline. Now ask yourself this. Who benefits from that kind of discipline? Certainly not the interviewer. A journalist gains credibility from unpredictability, from challenge, from surprise. But the guests benefit enormously from a controlled arc, from knowing where the conversation will land before it ever begins. And that's where the imbalance may have occurred. Because Oprah's role that night wasn't just interviewer, she was validator. Her reactions didn't interrogate the story, they reinforced it. When she appeared stunned, viewers felt justified in being stunned. When she went quiet, viewers leaned in. When she nodded, viewers nodded with her. That doesn't mean she was complicit. It means she may have trusted the framework presented to her. And trust, ironically, may have been the vulnerability. There's another detail people often overlook. Notice how the most explosive claims were framed emotionally rather than factually. The focus wasn't on specifics that could be immediately checked. It was on feelings, implications, interpretations. That's a powerful shield. You can't disprove how someone feels, but when feelings replace facts entirely, accountability gets blurry. And over time, that blurriness started to show. Subsequent interviews, podcasts, written statements, small but noticeable shifts in tone, clarifications that didn't quite match the original weight of the claims. Not outright contradictions, but soft recalibrations. Here's the contradiction. If the original interview told the whole truth fully and clearly, why did it require so much adjusting afterward? That's the question that unsettled many observers. Because carefully constructed narratives often share one flaw. They struggle to remain perfectly consistent once repeated outside their original setting. And the more the story was revisited, the more it felt like something had been carefully framed for that one moment in time. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable possibility yet. What if the deception, if it existed at all, wasn't loud or malicious? What if it was subtle? What if the interview wasn't scripted word for word, but emotionally scripted, strategically paced, structurally protected? And what if the person who believed most strongly in its authenticity was the person whose reputation made it unquestionable? Because if that's true, then the fallout isn't just about Meghan or Harry. It's about something far bigger. It's about what happens when trust itself becomes the instrument. Here's the part no one talks about. Not loudly, anyway, because once trust is cracked, the damage doesn't stay neatly contained inside one interview, one night, or one headline. It leaks, quietly, slowly, into everything that came after. Think about how that interview ended. There was no resolution, no verification, no counterbalance. Just a lingering emotional aftertaste that told the audience, you've seen the truth now. And once you believe that, you stop looking for anything else. That was the real power of the moment. Not what was said, but how final it felt. For a long time, the story didn't need defending. It defended itself. Anyone who questioned it was immediately framed as cruel, biased, or heartless. And that social pressure did something remarkable. It shut down curiosity. But here's the irony. Truth doesn't fear curiosity, performance does. As months passed, the emotional intensity faded, and people began to rewatch the interview. Not with tears, but with distance. And distance changes everything. Lines that once felt devastating began to feel rehearsed. Pauses that once felt raw now felt timed. Reactions that once felt spontaneous now felt familiar. That doesn't mean the pain wasn't real. Let's be clear about that. People can feel genuine pain while still telling a selective story about it. Those two things can coexist. But the more viewers re-examine the interview, the more one realization crept in. The narrative never evolved. In real life, stories grow, details sharpen, perspectives mature. People reflect, correct, and sometimes contradict themselves as they process experiences. But this story stayed frozen in amber. The same framing, the same villains, the same emotional beats. Almost as if it had been designed to live forever exactly as it was first told. And that's where the cost of belief comes in. Because belief isn't free, reputations were damaged. Relationships were severed, institutions were judged in the court of public opinion with no right of reply that could ever match the emotional force of that one interview. And once those judgments were made, there was no rewind button. Ask yourself something honestly. If even the possibility exists that the story was strategically shaped, does that change how you feel about the fallout? Not the feelings, the consequences. Because the most unsettling idea isn't that the interview may have been engineered, it's that it worked. It worked so well that it reshaped how stories are told now. Emotion first, verification later, if at all. It taught the media a dangerous lesson. If you control the narrative tightly enough, no one will ask what's missing. And maybe that's the final contradiction. An interview about breaking free from silence may have created a new kind of silence, one where skepticism was no longer allowed. So where does that leave us? It leaves us here, older, wiser, slightly less willing to accept perfectly packaged truths. Not because we've become cynical, but because we've learned that credibility doesn't come from who tells the story. It comes from how much scrutiny the story can survive. You don't have to pick a side. You don't have to hate anyone. You just have to ask better questions. Because once trust is broken, it doesn't shatter loudly. It fades. And when it fades, people stop believing not just the story in front of them, but the system that delivered it. And if this interview taught us anything, it's that the most powerful narratives aren't always the truest ones. They're the ones we want to believe. So the real question isn't whether the interview was scripted. It's whether we've learned to recognize the difference between truth and something that only feels like it.